Hi, I'm Cassie and welcome back to Afternoon Literature for another book report. Today we are going to be reviewing The Confessions of Frannie Langton by Sara Collins. So The Confessions of Frannie Langton is a historical fiction novel. It is Gothic literature inspired and it is based in the 1800s, mostly taking place in London. We follow narrator Frannie Langton as she is in prison, accused of the crimes of brutally murdering her master and his wife. Franny says that his wife was also her lover and that she doesn't have any recollection or memory of this crime. Okay, so what did I think of this book? Well, firstly, there's some very important things in this book that I think are a good reason to have read it and to have reflected on it. Firstly, this book is set against the backdrop of colonialism. We start to hear Franny's story as she explains her life on a plantation in Jamaica, which is owned by Langton, the white slave owner. Now, Franny feels separated from the servants on the plantation, but also obviously very separated from the white slave owners as she is a mulatto, so she is mixed race. During this time, Franny is given the opportunity to get some education. She learns to read and write, and this separates her even further, as at the time, anyone who was given the opportunity to read and write was seen as putting themselves above the rest of the slaves, but at the same time, they were not considered at all welcome within the white circles, and they would have been seen as inferior to anyone of the white race. Franny, therefore, is set up as a complete outsider on the plantation where she should probably feel most at home, and that continues as a theme throughout the novel. What also continues as a theme is the atrocities of both slavery and colonialisation that we see. In particular, we see some really horrific mentions of experiments that were done on black people, in particular, not just when they were dead as autopsies, but also done when they were alive, in particular involving things like pain and things like that. These were very harrowing and unfortunately things that are very real, which makes them even more horrific to see that this is actually historical fact rather than fiction. It's talked about throughout it that white people see black people as completely inferior, that they don't believe they have the capacity to feel pain, to understand education, they don't have the ability to behave in a civilized way or a civilized manner, and that actually slavery is doing them a service and it's kind of like a favour for them. And these were commonly held views, and also the ways that colonialism and slavery were justified. If they were being saved from themselves, and if they didn't feel pain, if they needed that to help them live a normal life, then actually people saw this as a way to look after them, or at least that's how they tried to justify it to themselves. This in itself is a very harrowing experience to read about and to understand. However, I think where this novel falls short is that although these are horrific things that are occurring, we don't really understand or see and feel the horror within the novel. In fact, it seems to be really surface level and almost skimmed over. Now, whether or not you would want to see this in detail, I can completely understand why someone would not want to write that, but I feel that it almost does a disservice to the amount of things that are in this book. We then move to a point where we are in England, and here we start to see some differing opinions. We get some ideas of the way that people were treated when they came to England, although they were no longer slaves because they were seen as free. They were very clearly, obviously, a servant underclass, even more so than other poor people within society, and they were constantly looked down on, or they were objectified and seen as things that someone could possess or own. So we then get a mixture between seeing someone like Franny, who's outcast within the servant realm, then outcast within the society that she is now placed in, and so she constantly feels like she can't fit anywhere, and someone like Laddie, who is taken in to the white society, but he's seen as an object, something that they can look at and praise and fawn over when they don't really want to know his proper opinions of it. This leads to the dichotomy between where these people fit? Do they really fit anywhere within this society? So although we are set against seeing some really horrific things, we're also seeing abolitionists, and actually the abolitionists don't really fully understand, and so actually weren't always doing the right things for black people at all. In fact, the place that Franny seems to find the most power and the most ability to be autonomous and make a life for herself seems to be the weirdest place for that to be. And that's when we see some cruelty imposed by a black person, and in seeing that, what we see is that this cycle of cruelty just constantly continues. So while they are incredibly important things to read in the novel, and I do think that they were something that needed to be tackled, so I really appreciate this book for doing that and for forming discussion in that way, what I felt was the worst part about this novel was the characterization and the structure used. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the characterization. We learn everything through Franny's eyes, and although Franny is an outsider to it, she's not a very observant outsider. She's incredibly naive, and so we don't really see or hear her reflections on other people. She's really self-centered, and so everything kind of becomes just her own internal monologue and internal thoughts. Because of that, every other character kind of feels very, very surface, and you don't get to know any of them, and so it doesn't seem very important when something happens to them. You don't feel any emotion or any empathy for them, and you don't really understand why they have behaved in the manner that they have. If Franny sees someone as a villain, they are a villain. If Franny sees someone as not a villain, that's it, and it's very black and white. Franny has clearly been hurt, and we can see that through the novel, but that colours pretty much her experience of everything. I think that what we could have had is a chance for her to be more observant and to offer a view of other people's perspectives in that way, although it would always be coloured through the first person narration. I also feel like Franny herself is not the most identifiable or empathetic character. She feels like a very unreliable narrator. You don't know how much of what she is saying is true, and how much of it is because she, was impaired in some way, whether that be through naivety, through innocence and not understanding fully, or whether it be through the fact that she wants to deny herself. It's called the confessions, which she is not being very truthful, and so a lot of the things that she has done is only revealed later. That brings me to another matter, the idea of revealing the true extent of her crimes. Some of the things that she did, especially in Jamaica, are revealed so much later, and because of that, it feels like the first whole half of the book is essentially completely unreliable and something you can't listen to, because Franny's trying to paint herself in the best light during that part of the book and not being honest with what she's done, whether morally or ethically wrong, something that we could potentially forgive her for, especially because of the situation she was in. When you then see that at the end, it kind of feels like a surprise, because everything is so brutal and so cruel, and then you're supposed to look back at the book and go, oh, I understand why that was so difficult and so hard. However, if you knew about what was happening at these times, it's not a surprise. For about 250 pages, it's hinted at, and you should have been able to figure out what these were anyway if you knew it. So by the time you get to that point, you're like, I'm not sure how much I really sympathise with this character anymore, because we don't feel any honesty. So the writer essentially puts a barrier between you and Franny throughout and stops you feeling sorry for her in a way that you should. I also feel like the structure of the story led to a really disjointed reading. This is essentially a very linear and chronological story. Franny talks about her childhood in Jamaica and then travelling to England and then experiencing life with the family and so on, leading up to the court case. We then see a little bit of the court case and then finally leading up to her execution and afterwards. So it runs in a very logical order. However, it starts with Franny in the jail reflecting on what happened and reminding you of it and telling you these confessions. And so there's constant interjections between Franny as an adult reflecting on the past, and that's why it feels so unreliable, because it feels like she is hiding things so clearly. We then see interjections between witness statements, court hearings and so on, which kind of take you out of the story and the moment. They make sense, to characterise a little bit of it, but they're not long enough to give you enough of a feeling of characterisation, and so they just feel jarring instead. And then telling the story in that order and continuing it after the trial, which I don't think we really needed, felt like it was just eked out. I found myself skimming a lot of the trial pages because I just didn't think they were really that important. And so I just kind of at that point wanted to finish the book. I feel like this really suffered from the fact that if it had actually just been a straight linear story, it would have really benefited and we could have really understood and felt what Franny was feeling and being there with her. But by trying to mess about with the story narrative, it just wasn't done in a way that was beneficial for the story and really acted towards its detriment. Okay, so this has been a very polarising book, and I would love to know your thoughts on it. My thoughts, it's a bit of 2 or 3 star overall. It's an important context, I get that, but it wasn't greatly executed. I would love to know more of your comments below. So please respond to this video and give it a like if you liked it. If you would like to see more book reports from me in future, then please subscribe to my channel. Happy reading.